Two guys, same salary, same $80,000 in savings. 20 years later, one of them is noticeably richer than the other, and it's probably not the one you're picturing right now. Meet Jake and Derek. They are both 32. They live in the same city. They both earn $80,000 a year. And after years of responsible financial decisions, canceled subscriptions, and convincing themselves that supermarket brand cereal tastes exactly like the expensive stuff, they've both managed to save $80,000. Financially, they are identical. Personality-wise, not even close. Jake likes stability in every part of his life. He likes having a plan and knowing what comes next. He wants a place that feels permanently his, a garage for tools he may or may not know how to use, a backyard he can slowly become irrationally protective of, and the freedom to make the place completely his own. Derek is different. He values flexibility. He likes keeping his options open and knowing he can change direction whenever he wants. He doesn't know where he'll be 5 years from now, and honestly, he prefers it that way. The idea of committing to the same address for the next 30 years makes him slightly more nervous than it probably should. Eventually, those two very different personalities lead them to two very different financial decisions. Jake buys a home. Derek keeps renting. A beat of stillness, both men's silhouettes standing at the same fork in the road, about to walk in opposite directions. And for the next 20 years, we're going to follow them both. Every mortgage payment, every rent increase, every repair bill, and every dollar Derek saves by renting and actually invests. Then, at the end, we'll see where two people who started with the exact same income, the exact same savings, but chose two completely different paths, actually ended up. Let's find out. Jake and Derek are currently renting in the same mid-sized American city. After months of searching, dozens of property listings, and more house viewings than Jake would ever like to admit, he finally finds the one. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small backyard, and a garage large enough to store exercise equipment he will never use. He decides to buy it. The home costs $350,000. Jake puts $70,000 down, exactly 20%. That leaves him with a $280,000 mortgage. But the down payment isn't the only money Jake needs to buy the house. There are closing costs, lender fees, title fees, inspections, prepaid taxes, and approximately 46 documents he's asked to sign while understanding almost none of them. Closing costs can often run around 2% to 5% of the purchase price. So, on a $350,000 home, Jake could easily spend somewhere between $7,000 and $17,500 just to complete the purchase. For our comparison, let's assume Jake's closing costs come to $10,000. So, before he has even moved in, Jake has already put his entire $80,000 into buying the house, $70,000 for the down payment, and another $10,000 in closing costs. He takes out a 30-year fixed mortgage at 7%. His monthly principal and interest payment is about $1,863. But that's just the mortgage. Owning the house comes with a few other monthly expenses. Around $350 in property taxes, $150 in homeowner's insurance, and Jake sets aside about $290 per month for maintenance, roughly 1% of the home's value each year. That brings his initial monthly housing cost to about $2,653. Meanwhile, Derek's calculation looks very different. He rents a comparable 3-bedroom home nearby for $2,000 a month. No property taxes, no homeowner's insurance, and if the water heater suddenly decides to retire, that's his landlord's problem. That leaves Derek with an extra $653 every month. For a brief moment, that money starts looking suspiciously like a trip to Thailand. But Derek resists the temptation. Instead, he decides to invest every dollar he saves by renting. Derek puts the $80,000 he did not use to buy a house into a broad stock market index fund, and from that point on, the $653 he saves each month goes straight into the same investment. At least initially, Derek's decision looks pretty good. He lives in a similar house, pays less each month, and has his money working for him in the market. Now, this is usually where someone says, "Yeah, but Derek is throwing $2,000 away on rent. Jake's mortgage payment is building equity." And technically, that's true. But there's a small problem. Especially in the early years, Jake's mortgage builds equity painfully slowly. In his first month, Jake pays $1,633 in mortgage interest, $350 in property taxes, $150 in insurance, and $290 budgeted for maintenance. So, out of Jake's total $2,653 monthly housing cost, only about $230 actually goes toward building equity. The other $2,423 is simply the cost of owning the house. Meanwhile, Derek pays $2,000 in rent. Yes, that rent builds no equity. But calling rent throwing money away while pretending mortgage interest, property taxes, insurance, and roof repairs are investments is creative accounting. Now, let's fast forward 3 years. Jake has made 36 mortgage payments, built up some equity, and learned one of the first lessons of home ownership. When you own the house, every strange noise suddenly has financial consequences. One Saturday, the water heater stops working. Jake watches a YouTube video titled, "Easy Water Heater Fix. Anyone can do this." 4 hours later, he calls someone who actually can. The repair cost him a few hundred. Fortunately, expenses like this are exactly why Jake has been budgeting for maintenance. After 3 years of mortgage payments, Jake's mortgage balance has fallen from $280,000 to about $270,835. He has paid down just over $9,000 of principal. Now, let's assume his home has appreciated at between 3% and 4% per year. The house is now worth somewhere between roughly $382,000 and $394,000. That leaves Jake with approximately $112,000 to $123,000 in home equity. That is real wealth. Meanwhile, Derek has paid $72,000 in rent over those 3 years, but his original $80,000 has remained invested. At a 10% annual return, that initial investment alone has grown to roughly $106,000. Derek has also continued investing the monthly difference. Add those contributions and their growth, and his portfolio is now worth roughly $130,000. So after 3 years, the result is surprisingly close. Jake has built substantial home equity. Derek has built a substantial investment portfolio. Jake can paint the living room whatever color he wants. Derek can move next month. But as the years go by, the costs on both sides begin to change. Jake's principal and interest payment remains fixed, but that doesn't mean the total cost of owning his home stays exactly the same. As the value of the property rises, his property taxes rise with it. Insurance gets more expensive. And as the house gets older, the repair bills start becoming more ambitious. Meanwhile, Derek has a growing expense of his own, rent. He starts out paying $2,000 a month, but every year his rent creeps a little higher. $2,000 becomes $2,060, then roughly $2,122, then a little more the year after that. Nothing about the house has changed except the amount leaving Derek's bank account every month. Apparently, his landlord is also a big believer in compound growth, and with rent increasing by around 3% a year, the $653 monthly advantage Derek started with slowly begins to disappear. And this is where time starts working in Jake's favor. The principal and interest portion of his mortgage stays fixed while Derek's rent keeps climbing. But Derek still has one major advantage we haven't fully accounted for. Derek's original $80,000 has been invested in the stock market this entire time. And that brings us to one of the biggest factors in this comparison: opportunity cost. At a 10% annual return, that $80,000 has the potential to grow dramatically over the next 2 decades. And that's before counting any additional monthly investments. That doesn't mean Jake is losing out. His money went toward a home that was also appreciating and building equity, but that $80,000 had an alternative use, and an honest comparison has to count it. Now let's jump to year 10. Jake is 42. His home, appreciating at between 3% and 4% per year, is now worth somewhere between roughly $470,000 and $518,000. After 10 years of mortgage payments, his remaining loan balance is about $240,000. That leaves Jake with roughly $230,000 to $278,000 in home equity. He now walks around the property with the confidence of a man who owns about half of every brick. Over the decade, he has also spent money maintaining and repairing the house. Some of that improved the property. Some of it simply stopped the property from slowly returning to nature. Derek, meanwhile, has kept investing. At a 10% average annual return, his original $80,000 alone is now worth roughly $207,000. And throughout those 10 years, he has also invested the money he saves each month by renting. That amount started at $653 a month, but gradually became smaller as his rent increased by 3% each year. Add those monthly investments and their growth to his original $80,000, and Derek's portfolio is now worth roughly $290,000. So, after 10 years, Derek is still ahead in liquid financial assets. But something important has changed. His rent is no longer $2,000. After 10 years of 3% annual increases, it's approaching $2,700 per month. Jake's principal and interest payment is still about $1,863. Now, let's go to year 20. Jake and Derek are 52. Jake's home, appreciating at between 3% and 4% per year, is now worth somewhere between roughly $632,000 and $767,000. His mortgage balance has fallen to about $160,000. That leaves him with somewhere between roughly $472,000 and $607,000 in home equity. Derek's portfolio has also been compounding for 20 years. His original $80,000 alone is now worth roughly $538,000 at a 10% annual return. And that doesn't include the additional money he invested during the years when renting was cheaper. Add those monthly investments plus the returns they earned, and Derek's total portfolio is now worth roughly $750,000. So after 20 years on pure net worth, Derek has come out ahead. But their wealth looks very different. Steve's is much easier to access. Jake cannot sell 8% of the kitchen, at least not without creating some serious questions from future buyers. But Derek still has one cost that never disappears: rent. After 20 years of 3% annual increases, his original $2,000 rent is now around $3,600 per month. Jake has only 10 years left on his mortgage. Derek's rent has no finish line. But Derek's result comes with one very important condition. He actually had to invest the difference. Every month for decades. When the market rises, you invest. When it falls 30%, you invest. When financial news announces the end of capitalism for the fourth time that decade, you invest. The spreadsheet assumes discipline. Human beings often have other plans. The money he was supposed to invest becomes a nicer car, a few holidays, a slightly more expensive lifestyle, and 10 years later, the investment portfolio that looked fantastic in the spreadsheet somehow never made it out of the spreadsheet. A mortgage, on the other hand, creates a form of forced saving. Jake doesn't decide every month whether he feels like building equity. The bank has already made that decision for him, and behaviorally, that matters. But buying has weaknesses of its own. The first is time. If Jake had sold after only 3 years, the closing costs going in, selling costs coming out, and interest-heavy early mortgage payments could easily have wiped out much of his advantage. Buying generally needs time for the numbers to work in your favor. The second issue is mobility. Imagine that several years into their journey, both Jake and Derek receive incredible job offers in another state. Derek's decision is relatively simple. He gives notice, packs, and leaves. Jake can move too, but he has another decision to make. He can sell the house, which means dealing with selling costs and finding a buyer, or he can rent the house out and move. But now he has a mortgage on one property, rent in another city, and a tenant who may or may not cover all his costs. Then there is concentration risk. Derek owns a diversified portfolio containing thousands of companies. Jake owns one house, on one street, in one neighborhood, in one city. Renting becomes more attractive when home prices are high relative to rent, when flexibility has real value, and when the renter actually follows through on investing the difference. And of course, it doesn't have to be either or. Buying a home doesn't mean you have to stop investing, because personal finance is rarely about finding one perfect strategy. It's about understanding the trade-offs. Jake traded liquidity and mobility for stability, leverage, and long-term control over his housing. Derek traded housing certainty for flexibility, liquidity, and more money invested in financial markets. Neither choice was automatically smart. Neither was automatically stupid. The real decision comes down to two questions. How long are you actually going to stay? Because if you buy a house and leave 3 years later, transaction costs can punish you. And if you rent, will you genuinely invest the difference? Because if you rent for 20 years and spend every dollar you save, the investment advantage disappears. So no, rent isn't automatically throwing money away. Renters pay rent. Homeowners pay interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and transaction costs. Both are paying for housing, and homeownership can absolutely build enormous wealth. But it's also an expensive, illiquid asset with ongoing costs, concentration risk, and a roof that occasionally requests $12,000. The winner isn't always the homeowner, and it isn't always the renter. Jake needed to stay long enough for buying to work. Derek needed to invest consistently enough for renting to work. Because 20 years later, the difference between them didn't simply come down to who bought and who rented. It came down to what they did after making that decision. Subscribe to Logical Money for more videos breaking down the logic behind the financial decisions we make every day. And let me know in the comments. Are you buying, renting, or waiting for interest rates and house prices to both come down at the same time? In which case, I admire your optimism. See you in the next one.